What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome to America Trends. I'm Larry Rifkin, and let's welcome David Schoenbrod to America Trends to put forward some really interesting concepts about why our government is broken, and we all believe that, and what we can do to trend more positively in the future. His book, D.C. Confidential, Inside the 5 Tricks of Washington, lays all of this out really explicitly. We encourage you to pick it up. First, David, somehow you got Howard Dean on the left and Senator Mike Lee on the right to say this is a good book and that you have figured out what some of the problems are in Washington. With a dysfunctional system like ours, how were you able to do that?
Well, I think they both understand that the real problem, the more fundamental problem than left versus right, is honesty versus dishonesty. And we have a dishonest system, and I think both of these fellows want honesty. Now, it's actually better for the politicians as well as us.
Now, many do think, as you know, David, that this is a left-right issue. So tell us why it's not that at all.
Well, I'm not saying there's no such thing as left-right issues, but the issue I'm talking about is this, is that Washington politicians get away with making rosy promises, yet evade blame for bad consequences. That's a people versus Washington issue. It's not a left-right issue. Both parties engaged in this evasion of blame for bad consequences.
And how can they get away with this?
Okay. Well, starting in the late 1960s, Congresses and presidents of both parties began to legislate in a new way, a way that uses these 5 tricks that let them evade personal responsibility. And one of the tricks they use is the money trick. And I can tell you about that if you'd like.
Well, I know you've got 5 key tricks, but before we get into those tricks, I mean, this whole notion that you can get elected, you can promise things, you can actually enact laws, and then you can run away from them. I mean, that seems to be odd, given the fact that we do have a House of Representatives that every 2 years has to go before the public. So explain how that works.
Well, when the people who wrote the Constitution wrote it, they had in mind 2 different things, both of which we needed to have a republic. One is that we elect the policymakers, and 2, that the policymakers be responsible for consequences. So that's why the Constitution says, for example, that these people are the people who are responsible for spending money, taxing us, and creating debt. And that's how it works. It works in a way for 150 years that these people were responsible for consequences. But then in the late 1960s, the elected officials figured out a way to beat the system. And I have a set of proposals to get them to shoulder responsibility once again.
We will get into all of that and all of the tricks. But this cutting of the cord, I'm still very curious as to why it was that when FDR did what he did, in terms of massive new programs on a social scale for Americans, why there was responsibility at that time for the consequences of those actions. But perhaps when LBJ put into effect Medicare and Medicaid, all those issues in terms of severing the relationship between what you did and what the impacts are, how that all dissipated.
Sure. So think about the country back in 1776, or the country in 1935 when Roosevelt and Congress created Social Security. Through most all of that time, this wasn't such a rich country. And so if politicians were going to make a big promise like all retired people get to have a pension, it wouldn't have been credible in the least unless they showed they really had a way of funding it. And so when they created Social Security in 1935, they imposed taxes that were fully sufficient to pay for the benefits then and in the future. Okay? and otherwise they just wouldn't have gotten credit for the promise of the good stuff. 1965, the country looks much different to people. It's the richest country on earth. The federal and the government seemed so capable. It had gotten us through the Great Depression, won World War II, invented the atomic bomb, built the interstate highway system, which didn't exist before. Mm-hmm. Now it was there. What a wonderful government. It ought to be able to promise us the heaven and the earth and the sky. And so we began to ask for more from government, like health care for the retired and all that kind of stuff. I'm not against it. I was all for it. But because of our rosy view of government, we were willing to accept the promise of the Medicare, even though they weren't imposing the taxes needed to pay for it. So what they were doing, basically, is setting up a situation such that to honor the promise of Medicare, future Congresses would have to significantly increase taxes.
So how did we get to a point where fiscal responsibility, which in large measure is what we're talking about, somehow was not required of them as long as the people were happy? Was it our fault that we allowed ourselves to sever the relationship between the benefits of the program to a lot of individuals and yet the consequences of not paying for it at that time?
Well, I think it was... in fairness to the politicians back then, a lot of what they were doing had to do with some wishful thinking, but it wasn't like they were being malicious. It's like you take the Clean Air Act, which was enacted about the same time, 1970. The thought was that if they set a deadline for making the air clean, that would force industry to invent affordable technologies that would make the air clean. And they called this technology forcing. And after all, America had just put a man on the moon in 1969. If we could figure out how to do that, we could figure out how to clean the air in an affordable way. At least that was the thinking. Okay, it turned out not to be true. It was over-optimistic. In order to meet the deadline for cleaning the air, we would have had to take 3/4 of the cars off the road in Southern California. That was never going to happen. And so there was a lot of these theories about, well, if we spend money, we cut taxes, somehow it's going to pay for itself. And, maybe it was smoking too much weed, who knows. But we enacted these things over-optimistically. And I don't think there's much point in deciding whether we should blame the people back then. The point is we need to wake up and realize that we have a government which has overpromised to us and which we have asked to overpromise to us. So the responsibility is today to fix the system that's gone haywire.
All right. I do understand your point fully. I really do. But what you're really talking about is akin to, wanting to go in, have a sumptuous meal, and then hightailing it out of the restaurant before the check comes.
Exactly. And when you think about one of the tricks is the federal mandate trick. There, basically, Congress promises benefits. It invites us all out to dinner. You're going to have a free dinner, and by the way, it's going to be paid for by the states. That's leaving the bill to the states. So in so many ways, they've hightailed out on the bill by shifting blame to others. So with the Medicare, they shift blame for the burdens of Medicare to future Congresses. On the federal mandate trick, they shift the blame to the governors and the mayors, and on it goes, so many different ways, such that our elected officials don't take the blame for the rosy promises they make.
Well, let's get into that, because you do have these 5 tricks. The book is called D.C. Confidential, Inside the 5 Tricks of Washington. David Schoenbrod is our guest today on America Trends. So since you were talking about the federal mandate trick, are we at it again as it relates to Medicaid, where we're going to block grant perhaps now Medicaid as part of the changes to the Affordable Care Act, and we're also going to limit per capita the amount that an individual may claim of Medicaid? Aren't we just shifting responsibility once again to state governments?
Yes, we are. I mean, it's like it's not just with the Clean Air Act where we did some of that as well. There's hundreds of different statutes that have been on the books since the late 1960s and put on the books since then that do this. So instead of getting into the mind-boggling details of the Affordable Care Act and the problems of trying to change it, it's all over the place, and both parties do it, and we got to stop it.
Okay, so that's the federal mandate trick. Move it from the feds back to the states, and then hold them responsible, and the feds can kind of wipe.
And the feds take credit for the benefit. The states are to blame for the burdens.
Okay, let's get back to your first trick, and maybe that's the precedent for all of this, the money trick. Now, what's that about?
Okay. The politicians in Washington promise us things we want, like tax cuts or more health care or improved infrastructure or whatever you have you, and they shift the blame for the cost to future Congresses and presidents. Now we know the trick's going on. I mean, you've heard about it off and on, but we don't see the sleight of hand that goes on here any more than we see the sleight of hand when a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat. Now, with the magician, we know the trick's going on, and we know the trick's going on with the money trick. And what I try to do is to show the sleight of hand. And let me explain to you what I think the sleight of hand is that makes the money trick go. They make very tangible to us the benefits they're giving. So they either send us a Social Security check, or they send us a letter saying the amount you're going to get when you retire is this amount. Well, that's great. That sounds good. We understand that as tangible. But what about the costs? Well, it turns out that most of the costs are going to be imposed down the road, and we kind of have an idea that there's this debt, and it's $20 trillion. Actually, the real debt, if we take into account the future benefits, is many times higher than that. But it doesn't get brought home to us in the way that a deposit in our bank account gets brought home to us. And the reports about this stuff are issued by the federal government the day before Christmas. It's like who's paying attention? And so, in other words, the trick basically is to make the benefits tangible and to make the costs intangible. And that's the sleight of hand that makes it go. And in my Honest Deal Act, which is my proposal to fix all this, I have a fix for the money trick.
Okay, we will get into all of that, but I want to make certain we lay out all the tricks. By the way,
Sure.
I know this is going on once again because everybody's waiting for the Congressional Budget Office now to score this new Health Care Act, and yet they're saying the Republicans, well, when the Democrats scored it, or at least this nonpartisan group, but they were in the majority, we still got the wrong numbers. Can we even begin to get the numbers right, or are the numbers just so large that they lose comprehension for most of us?
And we can get the numbers right, but the CBO is actually a pretty credible outfit. The problem is that Congress constrains them to do the numbers just for the next 10 years. So what they do is they build these statutes so that the really bad news comes after the next 10 years. That gets hidden.
Okay, there's a trick for you. I mean, when you talk about
part of the money trick.
Yeah, and David, when you talk about the money trick, and you didn't even go into the depth, when you said $20 trillion, and then you said it could be much higher than that.
Well, it is much higher than that.
Well, we've had Lawrence Kotlikoff on many times, and he, an economist from Boston University, said all the things that are left off the books. It's unbelievable. It's more aligned with $200 trillion. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I mean, I do. He's absolutely right that most of it gets left off. And the way, when I'm talking about, and the CBO is perfectly capable of figuring out what Kotlikoff knows, but they're just constrained from doing it by Congress. What I want to do with my fix for the money trick is to turn the CBO loose so they could do some honest accounting and then give the information to us. So just like we get a letter from Social Security saying, this will be your benefit, I want that same envelope to include a letter from the CBO saying, and by the way, for the government to continue all these current policies, they're going to do all these great things for you, we're going to have to increase taxes or cut spending this amount to the average family. Now, we can understand that.
Oh, absolutely. And I know that Dr. Kotlikoff says you're looking at about 40% in terms of reducing spending and perhaps even 30% in terms of increased taxes. Is that just totally unpalatable? Have we gone on with this trick too long to even begin to recover from the implications of it?
Well, I'm not saying that we should have some kind of constitutional amendment or something like that that requires the tax increases or spending cuts. I'm just saying we got to have the information out there. And once the information is out there, and by the way, the information I would require is not just the total cost, but how much the most recent Congress has made it better or worse, then the pressure goes on. The pressure goes on these elected officials to turn the ship of state. So I don't think we could do this by all of a sudden imposing all this stuff. What I can say, though, is that if we don't begin to change now, it's going to get much worse. And so part of what I would be saying this letter should state is not only what the cost per family would be now if Congress made the change now, but how much more it's going to be if we wait 10 years or 5 years or 15 years. Then it's much higher. So in other words, I think where we have to start is with informing the voters just where we're at. Because unless we do that, we never could change.
But they've been trying to sever responsibility in terms of the good stuff from the bad stuff for the longest time, and the bad stuff has continually gotten worse over this long stretch from the 60s to today. Why would there be any impetus for these politicians who annually or biannually get back into office to begin telling us the truth now?
It's a good question. And I have to tell you, when I started writing this book, I put it in terms of the politicians being bad people, being devils, But I had to think to myself, is that the way that the politicians, the members of Congress that I've known, and I worked in Congress in the 1960s, and I've known a lot of members of Congress since them. It's not how I see these people. The way I see these people is that they initially went into public service hoping to do honorable work, wanting to serve the public, wanting to be principled people. Then they found when they got there that they were located in an institution that already was doing stuff by way of tricks, and unless they went along, they would be marginalized in Congress and they'd lose in the next election because they'd be seen as the bearer of bad tidings. And so, in a sense, people who went in to serve honorably find they have to be dishonorable. And so think how they feel when they wake up in the morning and know that they're going to work in the most despised institution in America. These people, and many of them quit because they're disgusted. So I think that if they began to hear from constituents that we want honesty rather than garbage, then I think many of them would respond. And so you have the forwards to the book, Howard Dean, Mike Lee. These are two pretty influential people. They want to go honest. And I was just down in Washington yesterday talking to a bunch of former governors, and they say the same thing, that, they told me there's 11 former governors who are in the Senate, and these former governors are saying their worst day as governor was better than their best day as a senator. These people are disgusted.
Okay, but when all of these practices began, we loved Congress. I mean, they were held in high esteem. You talked about all the things that America had accomplished, and that would rub off on them and their reputations. And since that time, when they've been trying to divide responsibility from, benefit, somehow their rankings have gone down to 9 or 10% in the public's mind, and yet most individual congressmen, as long as they're in office, as their incumbency allows, they go back in. Explain this to us.
Well, it's simple to explain. Number one, they're saying rosy things like, I want you to have this, that, or the other thing you want. Number two, they've shifted blame away from themselves for everything we don't like about what government does. Oh, that was done by the agency, or that was done by the state, or whatever. Okay? Mm-hmm. And then they used to spend the lion's share of the congressional budget on figuring out how legislation is working and how to make legislation work better. Now the lion's share of the congressional budget is spent on doing constituent service. So most of what they actually do is doing favors for constituents. So you put all that together, they win re-election pretty much automatically.
Well, they're home all the time. They're speaking all the time. Sometimes we wonder how often they're really assembled to deal with some of these problems, or maybe they're so large at this point that they'd rather be away from Washington and telling people what they hope to do for them rather than what they can do.
Unless they spend, the way they feel about it, unless they spend the time at home, they aren't going to get reelected. And there's really very little, since they're not to blame for what government does, there's very little to be lost by neglecting work in Washington. And as it is now, today, as opposed to the 60s when I worked down there, they only spend 3 days or so a week in Washington. And when they're there, they only spend maybe a fifth of their time on legislation. The rest of their time is spent on things like fundraising. Well, fundraising is important for their getting reelected. The legislation and how it affects us isn't important to their getting reelected because they're not to blame for things that don't work.
Okay, let's go to another one of the tricks. I think you're making yourself very clear. The debt guarantee trick. What is this about?
Okay. So starting in the late 60s, the government began to guarantee the debts of the too big to fail banks and other very large financial institutions. And for that, charge no fee. Now, that's just astounding when you consider the fact that no private business would guarantee another business's debts for free. They'd charge a pretty hefty fee that would be higher the riskier the debts they're guaranteeing are, okay? Mm-hmm. So the fact that these big banks got free debt guarantees from the government increased their profits. Now, you may ask yourself, why were the elected officials giving welfare to Wall Street? And the answer is they were getting campaign contributions from these big banks, but the real cost of the debt guarantees is what would happen if the guarantees had to be paid off, and that wouldn't happen unless there was a financial crisis, which did come in 2007, years later. So the politicians that started the debt guarantees, they got the campaign contributions, but the blame was shifted forward in time to people in office when the financial crisis came. Now, and it's even worse than it seems because the financial crisis was caused by the debt guarantees. You know, what was going on is with the debt guarantees, these banks felt free to engage in all types of very risky lending and behaviors to make profits. But they couldn't have done it without the debt guarantees because they couldn't have borrowed the money to make the investments to do it if the people they were borrowing from knew they might go bust and that their debts wouldn't get repaid. But with the government in there, the banks were perfectly free to get involved in speculation, and the upshot was the Great Depression that put so many people out of work and so on. And so the banks got bailed out. The people who lost their homes weren't bailed out, by and large, and the public was really upset about the incumbents at the time of the bailouts. And of course, the people who did it, who really set the thing up, they're long since gone. So the incumbents passed the Dodd-Frank Act, promising it'll never happen again. But guess what? The Dodd-Frank Act continues cheap debt guarantees. Could you hear me there, Chris, out there in Connecticut?
Well,
kept the same thing up, promising that it wouldn't happen again.
Well, he's in Hollywood now. But David is the author of a new book, David Schoenbrod, and the book is called D.C. Confidential, Inside the 5 Tricks of Washington. And David, I also want to bring up the fact that you've been a leader of the Natural Resources Defense Council. And so a lot of the things that you have worked on in Washington over the years when you're looking to preserve environmental concerns relate to regulation. And you say there's another trick in all of this, the regulation trick.
Right. The way things worked until the 60s was that Congress either issued the regulations themselves, so in other words, it took credit for the benefits of the regulation and also the burdens imposed by the regulation, or it handed it over to a bunch of experts, and they got the credit or the benefits. Okay? In the 60s, in the late 60s, Congress figured out how to get the benefits, credit for the benefits of regulation, but to shift the blame for the burdens. And the way they did it is in the Clean Air Act and like statutes, they gave everybody a right to healthy air and said you can enforce that right by citizen suit in court. And by the way, the burdens will be imposed by the agency. So Congress gets the credit for the rights, and the agency gets the blame for the burdens imposed by the duties.
So
Yes,
is that
they
what
did.
the EPA is now facing? That as much as we love the clean water and the clean air, now they're looked upon as a bogeyman for all that's wrong with the economy because they're too regulation
Yeah.
heavy.
Yeah. And Congress told them to do all that. And not only then they told them to do it, they ordered them to do it and made the order judicially enforceable. And then Congress shakes its finger at the agency and says, "Oh, you regulate too much," you know. Well, bullshit. And if pardon the language,
We're
if
on
they
a
don't,
podcast. You can say that.
okay. And so if they don't deliver the healthy air that they promised, then they blame the agency for not delivering the healthy air. So it's like, heads I win, tails you lose deal.
Well, it's a great con game, and it's been going on for a long time. So,
And I got a fix for this one too. I mean, all these fixes I put into something called the honest.
oh, I know.
deal.
We're going to talk about that, but I do want to get to the fact, and just to give a reprise here, we've talked about the money trick, the debt guarantee trick, the federal mandate trick, the regulation trick, and one that I know when I was on radio I was talking about a lot was the war trick, where we have so isolated ourselves from the consequences of our incursions, invasions, and the like. And that is something that, again, I think the constitutionalists among us would say, how can Congress get away with abdicating their responsibility as it relates to war making?
Okay. So actually, it's a little constitutional. Speaking in terms of constitutional law, it's a little bit more complicated than most people think. The Constitution does give the power to declare war to Congress. However, in our entire history, there's only been 5 declared wars, the last being World War II. But there have been many, many dozens of wars, and until 1950, all of them were authorized, except those that were declared, were authorized by statute by Congress. So until 1950, all the wars were either declared or Congress authorized them. Either way, Congress was responsible for going to war. It changed in 1950 with the Korean War, and that got people very upset. And the upshot of that was the passage of something called the War Powers Act, which says that if the president wants to go to war, he has to issue a report to Congress. The report triggers a vote in Congress about whether to approve or disapprove. If Congress does not approve, the war must end. So the idea is Congress was reasserting its responsibility for war. A good thing. Okay? So the problem is there was a technical loophole in the War Powers Act, which many presidents have taken advantage of. So take Libya, okay? Many members of Congress wanted President Obama to go into Libya and unseat Gaddafi. But they said to him, don't submit one of those things under the War Powers Act, so we'll have to vote. We don't want to have to vote on this thing. Just do it. So Obama does it. Then he starts bombing in Libya and so on, and lots of members of Congress have the gall to say, President Obama is ignoring the War Powers Act. Now, why do they behave this way? Well, they don't really want responsibility for war because nobody knows how war is going to come out. So this way, by sitting back, not being responsible, if the war is popular, they can march in the victory parade. If it's unpopular, they can blame the president. Meanwhile, the upshot is, instead of fighting with our enemies, we're fighting with each other. It's insane.
But you say to us that we should look at the individuals within Congress as being honorable. They go there for the right reasons. And we're talking about something that seems
I'm saying they want to be honorable. They're not acting honorably, but they want to be, and we're going to benefit by helping them being honorable by asking them to be honest with us.
Okay, and we will get to that in just a moment. But I have to ask you this. If, in fact, these are halls that are populated by men and women who change all the time, and since the late 1960s, how many speakers of the House have we had? How many majority leaders, turnover in party, and so forth? You would think that during that period, some of these things are so obvious as to their deceptive characteristics that somebody would say, hey, we've got to deal with this. This is not right. America can't go on this way. We can't keep offloading responsibility. I mean, why during that period of time, with so many changes in personnel, has no one called into question these practices?
Well, it's interesting. I was talking on Tuesday down in Washington with the president of a very important bipartisan think tank, and he said, these new members of Congress come down here and they don't really understand these tricks. They don't even know they're going on. And as far as they know, this is just the way Congress works. So they don't see it. And I'll tell you this also, in working on this book, I was surprised nobody had not written it before. It is, and when you really think about it, it is so obvious. And yes, it's been pointed out that there is trickery in our government, for sure. But nobody's really written about the sleights of hand that make it work and how to stop it. And that's what I think I've made a real contribution here.
Oh, absolutely. But David, before we really do detail the Honest Deal Act, do you think that the populist uprising that we witnessed in American politics in 2016 is in some way a direct result of the five tricks? And did Donald Trump commandeer a movement that he is a false prophet of? Because he keeps telling us he's going to drain the swamp.
Good question. I agree with you absolutely. Yes, indeed, the 2016 election was a function of these tricks. Think about it. 1964, 70% of the American public say they trust the government to do the right thing. 2015, 19%. Only 19% say they trust the government to do the right thing. So the 2016 and Democrats, Republicans, Independents, they all say Washington insiders, a few Washington insiders, profit at the expense of the American public. So no wonder outsiders such as Trump and Bernie Sanders did better than expected in 2016. And yes, the public voted one way or the other to drain the swamp. But think about what keeps the water in the swamp. It's the tricks. And so, but Trump has promised to drain the swamp, but he hasn't looked for the plug. I mean, whatever you think about his proposals, some I like, some I don't like, but that's beside the point. The point is that he's not done a darned thing to get at the tricks. And in fact, if anything, he's perpetuating them. So, and I'm not saying that the Trump administration is hopeless on this part. Just so far, they've done nothing about the tricks.
You think he really thinks about these as tricks?
I don't think he knows about them, is my hunch.
Right.
But who knows? The thing is, I've written the book. I know it's going to be read by people in the administration and Congress. I mean, some of them have read it already. More are reading it now. If he doesn't do something about these tricks, bad on him.
Now, you advocate the passage of this Honest Deal Act as a solution to the five tricks. So explain it to us. I know I've asked you a lot of questions leading up to this, and I know this is really the most important thing, because we're looking at trends on this podcast. So do you think that your Honest Deal Act can get traction and become a new trend in terms of people demanding this or Congress wanting to reform itself in this way?
Okay, there's two questions here. What's the Honest Deal Act, number one, and number two, could it get through?
Right.
Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples of how the Honest Deal Act would force these elected officials to take responsibility for the bad news as well as the good news. So on the money trick, as I already indicated, I would have the government send every voter every year a letter stating what the fiscal future holds for us, just like the government requires lenders to inform us in writing of what we'll have to pay. Same idea. The same thing should be applied to Washington. On the federal mandate trick, I would require Congress to do roll call votes on these mandates, because the reason the mandates force governors and mayors to do the federal bidding is because harm will be done to the state. Well, let's have those elected politicians in Washington vote on whether they want to harm their own constituents. See what they say. On the debt guarantee trick, I would require that the too big to fail banks have to pay a fee set by the market, not set by the politicians, in return for their debt guarantees. That would take away the welfare from Wall Street and give them a powerful reason not to run excessive risks. On war, I would require wars to be voted on Congress. And on regulation, I would require Congress to vote on major regulations or deregulations. so that the politicians are responsible not just for promises of clean air, but if there's going to be a regulation of the power plants in Connecticut, then, or whatever, they should vote pro or con, and so we'll give them credit for the air being cleaner, but we'll also blame them for the electricity prices being higher.
Do you see anywhere where these practices of openness and clarity about responsibility are actually being put into effect? Are there state governments, are there cities of a large sort where some of these ideas are put into practice? Or are they actually required, in a sense, to do that because states generally can't print money, they can't go into debt every year, they have to have, quote-unquote, a balanced budget. So do you think there's much more honesty at the state level, and do you see anybody really leading this charge as a political figure?
I hear what you're saying. Okay. It turns out that after the federal government started playing the money trick, the states started doing it too, or many states do. And so even though many states have balanced budget requirements, they play around with their books. And there was a big report by Richard Ravitch and Paul Volcker that showed that many states are doing the same kind of thing. Some of these suggestions I'm making, a few states do these things, but if you're looking for precedent, for responsibility, our Constitution worked pretty much the way it was supposed to. Our government involved the elected officials being responsible for consequences for the first 150 years. And it wasn't really driven by the Constitution so much as by a tradition. The government worked in ways that made officials responsible. So we now have a new tradition where they're not responsible. With the Honest Deal Act, I want to create yet a new tradition for our time that makes them responsible. So that's what I'm trying to accomplish. Can it be done? That's your other part of your question, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I think what it takes is for a critical mass of us to begin to ask politicians to give us an honest deal. And on my website, dc-confidential.org, there's a simple tool you could use that would allow you in just a few minutes to send an email to members of Congress saying, I want an honest deal. I want the Honest Deal Act. And you could very simply send the same message to your friends and ask them to do the same thing as well. Now, why would a few voters be sufficient to turn the ship and begin to turn the ship of state around? Well, I got a number of answers to that. First of all, many of these people went into politics wanting to do honest work, and many of them still do. And so some encouragement would be awfully helpful. Second, there are many important political officials who really would value these changes. Like, for example, I mentioned, I was talking to 5 former governors yesterday. They applaud what I'm talking about here. And governors are the fall guys here, and mayors are too, because they're at the wrong end of the federal mandate trick. They're the ones to whom blame is shifted. And think about a president. The president can only serve for 2 terms, and presidents get elected hoping to leave a mark on history, to do the right thing. Well, if you've got a Congress that won't do a darn thing, who won't take responsibility, you can't get much done. So there's a way in which presidents and candidates for president are going to want this. And so to the extent voters are beginning to ask for an honest deal, people who want to be reelected to Congress are going to be interested in this. So I think some change, some thousands of people speaking up could begin to turn the ship of state.
Do you believe that they need to also undertake some other reforms in order for this to actually work? Everybody else who talks about this issue of what's wrong with Congress talks about campaign finance, independent drawing of district lines, term limits, these kinds of things. Is that a prerequisite for any of this, or no?
No, it's not a prerequisite. But let me take these one at a time. Campaign finance. We've been trying to get campaign finance that's really meaningful through for decades. And maybe someday it'll happen. In principle, I'd like it to happen. But even if we did get campaign finance through, the tricks would still be a big problem. All the incentives the tricks create would still be there. On the other hand, the tricks allow members of Congress to take campaign contributions in return for favors for the people who are doing the contributing, and hide from blame for the bad consequences for the rest of us. So in other words, the tricks allow money to speak even louder than it otherwise would in Washington. And to the extent that we end the tricks, the money is less valuable to the incumbents, and they're more willing, I think, then to begin to talk about campaign finance. So I think that ending the tricks is a good place to start on campaign finance. Not that I'm against reforms in campaign finance, far from it, but it's worth doing this anyway. As to the gerrymandering, I think it's disgusting that members of Congress could pick their constituents instead of the other way around. I've looked at the gerrymandering issue. I don't see any really easy solutions, but I'm all for it. But in any event, even if we end gerrymandering, we got to stop the tricks. Term limits. Well, the reason term limits are said to be needed is these guys go to Washington and serve forever. Why do they get to serve forever? Because the tricks allow them to be ever popular.
How long can we go? I know that there is a sense of urgency if we get serious about this before we all bankrupt ourselves into a collective delusion that somehow this can go on in the way that it has, particularly when you're looking at something like $200 trillion of debt. I mean, really, how long can we go without dealing with these tricks?
I think that's impossible to say. The point at which the debt gets to be too much is a function of when lenders decide that the United States can't repay its debts. And that could be affected by ever so many things, like a big earthquake in California or a terrorist attack that takes out the electrical grid for 3 months or something like that, or the kind of rancor that led to the 2016 election getting even worse. So all I could say is the longer it goes on, the riskier things get. I can't tell you what the breaking point is, though.
Well, that's a really fair answer. D.C. Confidential, Inside the Five Tricks of Washington. And David Schoenbrod, it has been our honor to have you with us today on America Trends.
Thanks for your probing questions. It was a very interesting discussion.
Thank you so much.